Thank you. Thanks. It's great to be here. And what a very stimulating few days we've had thinking about stone. Obviously, kind of feeding into my deep passion with the lithic. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leap straight in there. There's quite a lot of things that I'm going to say. Really, I'm going to give quite a lot of examples in trying to think about how we might consider the sensory and affective engagements with stone. That is, the kind of what kind of power, what kind of potency does stone possess in kind of stimulating these affective and sensory encounters. And as always, in my book, most things start with Doreen Massey. So rather than intrinsic and essential, Doreen Massey's seminal progressive sense of place focuses on how place is shaped by its relations with other places within networks and flows. And of course, these relational accounts extend understanding about how places are continuously emergent material assemblages that come from all sorts of differently stable or indeed changing flows of supply. And many places, if we go back in history, we can see that most places were originally constructed out of locally sourced materials. But in modern times, most cities, most large cities, are continuously reconstituted by a whirl of imported matter. And in the case of stone, by the geological supplies that emerge and come from other places. And so formerly reliable sources may be rapidly superseded or exhausted while new supply sources are discovered. But despite this ferment of material transformation, and this is kind of interesting thinking about I suppose, mobility, changing durability, stone does continue to provide a degree of durability and consistency to our worlds. But though this should never blind us to the dynamism of lithic substances. Volatile processes that new materialist thinking has brought to attention. So, as well as revealing the agencies of other non-human forces, these relational vitalist understandings of place have generated conceptions that emphasize the potency of affect sensation and things like atmospheres we've heard over the last day or two. And I kind of think this is kind of really important, really, when we think about what place is and that the unspoken qualities of place that we experience as we inhabit it. So the kind of things that I'm talking about are part of a much larger world in which we can consider a whole wealth of place-based qualities that indeed foster a range of emotional, affective and sensory responses. So consider the seasonal growth of plants and trees, the familiar sounds of birdsong or particular music, the ways in which local people move and talk, local tastes and smells, the tones of street conversation, the affective intensities that accumulate in spaces of public gathering, like train stations, for instance, everyday pedestrian and vehicular rhythms, or the cloudiness, the cloudlessness of the sky. And there's loads of other things that I could cite. And so one such which I'll refer to again is colours, is the colour of place, which I want to kind of foreground a little bit. And in paying attention to these qualities, we can better grasp those characteristics of place and also landscape that we feel, but we often barely register. So often this is kind of quite unreflexive, but nonetheless, when we're out of place, or maybe when we come back to it after a long spell away, we kind of notice these things. As Monica Dagan et al. Insists, people produce aesthetic relations through specific everyday practices: touching, looking, photographing, sitting, listening, and climbing. And so, though, again, this kind of foregrounds how rather than subjects detached from the world, we see with light, we move with surfaces, and we feel with stone. So inhabitants, wherever we might live, we serially encounter place as a perceptual and sensory realm, saturated with historic resonances from our own lives and those of others. And most of the time, we don't think about this. We carry out habitual and unreflexive routines, but also our habitual routines are collectively shaped, so they intersect with those of others to generate a shared sense of inhabitation. So if I talk about, I don't know, let's say the stone of Lancaster, which I'll refer to later, other Lancaster inhabitants might recognise what I'm talking about without having thought about it very much. Now, just as a sort of caveat, the sensory apprehension of space and materiality is also profoundly shaped by bodily capacities and dispositions that are related to age, class, sex, and physical activity. So we don't all experience these things in the same way. So the feel of a hard concrete floor may impact on the experience of a wheelchair user very differently to a pedestrian, most obviously. Okay, so what I want to do then is exploring the ways in which stone contributes to an affective and sensory experience in place. I want to focus on three themes. First of all, I want to think about how stone shapes, especially the colour and the tactility of place. I want to then consider more intimate engagements with stone by very skilled practitioners. And then finally, I want to talk about the kind of freakier sort of encounters that might be generated by the ways in which stone is haunted by a range of intimations. Okay, then, so first I want to consider the contribution of stone to the colour of place and its textures, tactility, and its haptic qualities. And I'm going to primarily, but not only, focus on Melbourne's basalt, which is usually called bluestone. Now, look, first just a word about colours. Colours, because I'm going to talk about colours, and I think the colour of place is kind of really significant. And it's been massively ignored by geographers. I don't know why, but it has. So colours are not intrinsic, but are a product of both the electromagnetic spectrum and visual perception. As Diane Young submits, an anthropologist, colours animate things in a variety of ways, evoking space, emitting brilliance, endowing things with an aura of energy or light. And they can be combined to create a medley of affective and sensual impression. That's usually interwoven with diverse cultural symbolic associations. So the symbolic and the affective and the sensorial kind of all combine in various ways. So in the mid-19th century, I'm talking about basalt, and this is an example of bluestone here in Melbourne. Basalt was discovered to be the predominant rock that lay under large swathes of what was to become Melbourne. Melbourne was only founded in 1836. Before that, there was no city. And it became the richest city in the world in the mid-70s because of the gold rush. So it's an incredible story, Melbourne. But Melbourne was rapidly deployed bluestone as a building material for the emergent city. And it was especially used in the construction of cottages, factories, churches, administrative buildings, and especially widespread in churches and the laneways, as I'll demonstrate. Now, the deep blue-black of the basalt absorbs light, as you can imagine, so that it stands out as markedly darker than the lighter-toned brick and concrete of the city. And as you can imagine, also, this is really accentuated during the summer when the radiant light blasts the city, and the lighter-hued surfaces reflect light, but the gloomy colour of the bluestone absorbs light in a different way. Now, this gloomy colour can make a powerful impression on visitors. So, for example, architect Norman Day contrasts Sydney's sandstone textures and slippery and fluid. There it is, lovely Sydney sandstone, they say. With Melbourne's basalt, which turns an ugly, wet black when it rains, while novelist Delia Falconer describes sandstone as a kind of bass note to Sydney. In addition, its dark hue means that during the hot summer months, as I've already, besides absorbing light, it therefore also absorbs heat. And after several hours of exposure to the sun, it can be really hard to sit down. Like, you don't want to sit down on a bluestone pavement or surface. But also, the effects of rain are especially notable on the glistening cobbles of the bluestone laneways. Their dark colour, augmented by their reflective, shiny surfaces, rendered especially potent during the reflective illumination when darkness descends. Now, the most pervasive historical presence of bluestone is, as I've mentioned, in the 19th century cobbles of the numerous narrow laneways that crisscross the city, in the suburbs, and especially in the centre. At the time of their construction, these road surfaces were plied by carts, the horses that pulled them, and their passengers. And these dense surfaces have proved incredibly durable over the past century and a half. And I think they can kind of conjure up a sharp sense of the past. we can sensorially imagine their 19th century affordances and imagine the passage of horse-drawn carts, the rhythmic clattering of the unyielding iron of cartwheels and horses' hooves, and the rich aroma of plentiful horse manure. That's what they were designed for. They were designed for carts and horses. We wouldn't build this kind of road for cars now, of course. But at any time today, when we kind of walk through the laneways, it's kind of rarely eurythmic because the ground underfoot must be scrutinised for irregularities that might cause us to lose balance, especially if we're equipped with slippery soles and, God forbid, high heels. Yet these uneven affordances also generate pleasurable engagements. So a vigorous sporting confrontation with bluestone cobbles takes place during the annually staged Roubaix, Roo as in kangaroo, initiated in 2006. And during the event, hundreds of cyclists follow a 40-kilometre route organised predominantly through the bluestone laneways. And the occasion is named after a more gruelling sporting competition, the Paris to Roubaix race. Roubaix, the town in northern France, that's also staged along aged cobbled roads. But the Melbourne course similarly offers a stimulating, if shuddering experience, soliciting a kind of quite intimate encounter with a unique aspect of the lithic materiality of the city. Now, until a few decades ago, Melbourne used to look at these cobbled laneways and the bluestone buildings with a bit of shame. They thought, well, what an unattractive city we are. They were commonly attributed as being outmoded, crude and unpleasantly dark. But, as you can probably imagine, with the rise of heritage thinking, bluestone cobbles have become reappraised as signifiers of Melbourne's identity, and they've been subject to a really extensive programme of conservation. Now, but what's really interesting, and this kind of relates to what Fritha Jenkins was talking about, she was talking about going to this quarry and the saws that cut through the very durable material. And not only are these earlier laneways renovated, but the asphalt and concrete pavements of the city centre are being ripped up and replaced with new Victoria-sourced bluestone paving, so from about 100 miles away, further entrenching the importance of basalt to the city's identity. But what's kind of interesting about this is that rather than rugged and kind of rough and difficult to walk upon, these machine-cut elements, not with mallet and chisel, they offer non-slippery, very pleasing, non-slippery, smooth surfaces to walk upon, and they provide a dramatic sensory and effective contrast to the cobbles laid out in the old laneways. And what's interesting as well is they're also being used in new sculpture, and this is Aki Makingawa's beautiful. I kind of love this. This is to honour Federation of the 5 states of Australia uniting at the start of the 20th century. And this is bluestone, of course. And then also they kind of used in architecturally these kind of very, very thin veneers of bluestone clad this library in a part of Melbourne. But in thinking about this laying of stone, here, bluestone, across urban environments, I kind of think it's timely to take note of what Paul Carter says, is that we become detached from a sense of land or ground due to the engineered surfaces that clothe the city. So he says, we walk with the surface, we do not align our lives with its inclines, folds and pockets. We glide over it, and to do this is to render what is rough, smooth, passable. We linearize it. So it's worth thinking about what lies beneath. Now, I just want to provide 2 other examples of how stone greatly contributes to the sensory and effective qualities of place. Does anybody know who this is? It's Aberdeen, commonly known as the Granite City, and with good reason as well. And the Granite City is based on the fact that most of the stone that was used to create the city was quarried since the 17th century from the massive but now disused Rubislaw quarry. And that's it. That's a Rubislaw quarry. It was incredibly deep and a kind of a huge quarry that in Aberdeen, on the sort of outskirts of Aberdeen, that provided most of the stone. And especially if you go to Aberdeen in winter, the silvery colour of the granite matches the colour of the skies very often. And the cold temperature of this northeast Scottish city generates a pervasive greyness, which is it kind of accentuates the temperature. It feels cold. It looks cold. It's kind of quite, but it's also incredibly durable. Rather differently is this, which I think most of you will recognise as Bath, largely fabricated from the Jurassic Oolitic limestone sourced from underground quarries to the east of the city. It's a monotonal yellowish honey hue. And we can find that it colours Roman baths, medieval walls, the 16th century abbey, Palladian crescents, Georgian bridges and squares, and also grand and mundane contemporary structures. Its mellow tint glows in the strong sunlight, as you can see here, producing a colour experience that in its material consistency contrasts with most other British seas, which are multi-hued. They have multiple hues. But as you can see here, this is kind of very sort of monotonal. And this unfluctuating historic fabric has encouraged the city to be assigned World Heritage status by UNESCO, who consider this uniformity to have provided, I quote, an integration of architecture, urban design, landscape setting, and the deliberate creation of a beautiful city. Accordingly, the local council specifies that any new buildings have to be created from Bath stone to consolidate this urban identity. Now, in many places, in fact, probably most places now, disembedding processes have accelerated as increasingly efficient transport technologies make stone supply an overwhelmingly global industry. The rise of shipping containers, logistics and cargo technologies have enormously expanded contemporary options. This is stone. The middle one is a tower block from Melbourne. The stone comes from the red granite stone. It comes from Norway. So much contemporary building stone is supplied from ever fewer super quarries, as economies of scale and technological advances have drastically reduced price. Smaller local and national quarries therefore become redundant. And there's a whole lot that I could say about this, but I won't now. But what we see now in cities is that cities are increasingly detached from their formerly local stone source that supplied stone for the buildings of the cities. And often they're a kind of hodgepodge of these kind of global things. Okay, secondly, I want to focus on more intimate relationships with stone. And what I'm going to focus on three things. And there are many other folk that I've kind of interviewed and discussed, but I want to focus on a sculptor, a performance artist, and also Aboriginal relationships with stone, which I hope will be instructive. Now, as Trevor Marchand insists, the development of skilled knowledge does not emerge in a vacuum, but from a context that includes artifacts, tools to hand, and raw materials, space, place, and architecture, paths and boundaries, time frames, and temporal rhythms, light, darkness, and weather. So these things are kind of really deeply situated, this acquisition of skill. And working in these environments also involves being amongst a community of practitioners, with novices inculcated into shared values, ethos, and social persona, and the learning of related professional competencies through specialised training and work on the job with fellow artisans. You may know that, if you're a musician or if you're kind of, an expert in any craft, like these practitioners, people who work with stone in various ways, often enter what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi terms a state of flow, an absorbed, attentive disposition that's acquired as eyes, muscles, hands, and somatic balance become attuned to working with stone. And this also recalls Lefebvre's notion of dressage, a mode of learning through reiterative practice that conditions the body into performing repeated manoeuvres, but it also facilitates and fosters an adaptive capacity to emerge to contingencies. Now, multisensory aptitudes are also enhanced by what Christina Grassini famously refers to as skilled vision. So the stone sculptor performs continuous micro-adjustments to shift position, balance, and weight force through the body. And the eye continually checks progress, but also the hand modulates its grip and a balance unseasonably shifts. So to develop this understanding of sensual engagement, I want to consider the very eloquent reflections of Jenny, who is an experienced sculptor from Melbourne. And she uses usually uses marble, alabaster and soapstones, are very different materials that are all imported from just outside Victoria due to what she perceives as the dearth of local stone suited to sculpting. Now, she particularly focuses on attraction to alabaster and marble. And she brings out the particular sculptural affordances formed from each stone. So in the case of alabaster, she says, for me, the alabasters, especially the pale-coloured alabasters, are a very feminine stone. And I feel that I need to make very soft and very flowing, gorgeous, rounded and organic-looking pieces. It's the look of it, the sense I get from it. I look at it and start doing something flowing with it. You want to touch it because it has a kind of translucence and a fragility, though it's still quite hard. So that lovely movement in the stone is what I want to expose, rather than create a thing that's rather geometric and rigid. I work with how the stone moves and behaves. And then she continues by discussing the properties of marble, which she regards as a completely different beast altogether, she says. It certainly behaves differently to any other stone. There's something very in-depth about it. I don't know if that's because of the many years that it's taken for it to be created, but marble has a creaminess and an earthiness to it, even though it's hard, and it's sparkling too, which is always a lovely thing. The crystals sparkle, not hugely, but there is a glisten. It holds form and edges beautifully. But I think marble can get very cold and it can be too angular. And so I try to make a soft flowing and organic form also from this. And then, having discussed the virtues and specific affordances of her favourite stones with which to sculpt, she considers how a tactile knowing characterises her practice. And she says, the more you work with it, the more it becomes tactile, more than just a lump of stone. And it's got ridges and roughness and things. You start to create shapes or a line, and my instinct is to feel that line, because I think you feel more than you see. Every day as you press forward, it feels different until you get to that point where, I love this shape. I like that hole there. I like the roughness that I've created there. And that's on a tactile basis and on an emotional basis. I can see where it's going, and problem solving comes in. How am I going to achieve that? Is it going to look good? And you're constantly processing these questions. So it's this constant evolution. The joy, of course, is at the end when it's all finished and you polish it up and you're happy with it. Maybe there's a little bit of colour that I preserved as a feature, or some raw stone so that people realise what the raw stone is like. She makes evident that this ongoing sensuous interaction with the material is mobilised through the sense of touch, but she also refers to a sonic engagement with stone as it is worked that also forms the sculpting process. I hadn't anticipated that at all. She said the sound is really important because when you tap a stone, it rings, and if it doesn't ring, there's either a fault or a different kind of stone in there. Or maybe there's a chunk that's already got a fracture, and that chunk's going to fall off. But the sound of it is really lovely too. So marble, when you hit it with a chisel, it just pings, it chimes and resonates. If you hit soapstone with a chisel, it sounds different to the sound of marble. They all make very different sounds depending on how dense the stone is. And to conclude then with the section on Jenny, I think she's so eloquent. I mean, I couldn't have explained this as well as she does. She attempts to further identify the improvisational, skillful and sensory processes involved in sculpting stone. So she says, I rarely map out a sculpture in total. Sometimes I have an idea of what I want to create from that piece of stone, but I'm not sure of the actual form, so I think what's the best use I can get from the stone rather than trying to shoehorn a design in. I'll turn it upside down and work out how it's going to stand, but it's not always a thought. The brain is processing on a different level. A good analogy for this is what my son says. He used to dance. I'd ask him, well, how do you know when to do that move and at what point? Don't you think about what kind of steps are going to come up next? And he smiled at me and he said, I just go to that place that you go to when you sculpt. The heightened knowledge of stone that's emerged out of her career working with diverse stony materials marked Jenny's experience as a sculptor. And she, as you can probably anticipate from everything I've just said, she possesses this incredibly highly attuned, skillful and sensuous knowledge about distinctive stony properties. And that's really deepened by time and repetition. Okay, so now I want to refer to a very different encounter with stone, but also kind of quite skillful. And it's about a performance artist and her project in which she smashed stone, not any stone, but bluestone is very hard basalt. And so this is a more vigorous encounter. And this, of course, in the context of Melbourne, smashing stones with a huge sledgehammer was undertaken, grueling heavy labour undertaken by convicts and workers in breaking rocks, working in quarries and building roads in 19th century Melbourne. And she explored this in a 3.5-hour endurance performance. That's what she called it, an endurance performance. I don't know how she did it, really. And her name is Amy Jo Jory. And in 2015, she created this thing called this event called Listening to Stones Part 1. And she used a sledgehammer to smash 1.5 tons of bluestone rocks. There she is. And the 19th century blocks had been hand-cut by convicts to form the walls of a now demolished building. So they had a prior purpose. Besides exploring the experience of undergoing the trial of very hard labour, the artist sought to advance several other ideas. On one level, the performance was an act of resistance to the ongoing process to cover colonised land with lithic layers. I've already referred to that in the coating of the city. And she sought to break up a small part of this material layer and return it to the ground from which it was extracted. Explaining this, Amy Jo described that the returning of the stone back to country was like opening a main line to the past, a hammered methodical howl, a sense of violent rejection of colonial history, of gender stereotypes, of ecological destruction. These ideas were bound up in the historic square hand-cut stones of the past. I was releasing them, which is a really interesting quote, I think. This aligns with how the land on which Melbourne stands has been sensorially transformed, heavily coated with lithic and other material surfaces that cover up the earth and stone that lies beneath. The artist also thus looked to challenge highly gendered assumptions that heavy work with stone is solely the preserve of men, by exemplifying how a woman may also perform arduous labour. She persisted with the task until almost all the blocks had been reduced to rubble. An early sign of the physical toll the work was taken was the swelling of her right forearm, instigated by the painful vibrations caused by each hefty blow of sledgehammer on very obdurate stone. The toughness of the bluestone meant that as many as 40 strokes would be required before the material cracked. In the early stages of the performance, Amy Jo explained that it was difficult to achieve an effective grip on the sledgehammer's long wooden handle, yet gradually becoming skillful, she developed a rhythmic swinging motion to ensure that the momentum of the sledgehammer's metal head struck the stone with sufficient force, entering the state of flow that I was referring to earlier. I was in a heightened state where pain was irrelevant. I felt it in the beginning, but it disappeared. It was just the sound of my hammer smashing on rock and releasing it. I was calm and determined. After 3.5 hours of pounding the stone, she seized, realising that unlike the slaves and prisoners and convicts of the past, she was not subject to the punishing regimes enforced by overseers. Although exhausted, the work brought forth a sense of achievement and pride in mobilising the physical and mental strength necessary to complete this task. She said, I was tired after hours of doing this extreme labour. I was also electrified. I was fierce. This resilience was fortified by the supportive, empathetic response of onlookers to this extreme work. I carried the viewers with me, she says. When the stone did break, there were audible sounds of relief from the audience. So the physical effort also transmitted itself to the watching audience. So this labour, I think here, this artist's labour, can be conceived as an intensely sensuous engagement that encounters bluestone's resilience and variability, and in which repeated blows against an unyielding lithic material impact profoundly upon the body's muscles, sinews and bones. And the performance reminds us of the intense labour and physical energies that have been expended in creating the city, especially in former years. Countless acts that have laid down the foundations and structures of the built environment. And so the smashing of stone summons up the dogged perseverance required by manual workers and the forced labour of convicts, and conjures up a sense of the pain felt through the body, muscular exhaustion, and the discomfort generated by a film of dust and sweat that covers the skin and clogs the throat. Okay, so I want to finish with this second section, with a very different way of working the stone. So here's these people who kind of would have worked with stone in the past. I mean, imagine Just imagine that, if you can, for a minute. Okay, so these are just two examples that disclose how very different ways of working with stone are productive. So I'll go back to that one. Are productive of skilled and sensuous understanding, forms of knowledge that veer sharply away from classification and geological comprehension, and it developed through a sustained intimate relationship with stone over time. And what this does is it reveals stone's multiple affordances and potentialities, as well as its capacities to enhance creativity and foster sensuous and emotional experiences in very diverse ways. So ways of knowing and working are based on affective and sensory attunements that develop through focused, sustained immersion in training and experimenting. And that explore stone's properties. They develop skilled vision, manual dexterity, a heightened sense of touch, awareness of sound, kinesthetic abilities, muscular aptitude, and a pragmatic consciousness through which the fragile, friable, durable, textural, and pliable qualities of stone come to be known. And as part of this section, I also looked at quarry workers like these people here, stonemasons, flint knappers, lithographers, and stone balancers. Now, what I want to focus on now, just to, as I said, to conclude this section, is about memorialization. Now, we know we're all kind of familiar with the statue wars that seem to have kind of unfolded over the last few years. And indeed, in Western practice, commemorative inscriptions of identity and symbolic meanings can be sculpted into stone and installed into public space. Lancaster has lots of these as well. And this exemplifies what Tim Ingold refers to as the modern cleavage wrought between nature and culture through the hylomorphic model of creation, where humans impose form with a particular end or goal in mind, while matter is regarded as passive and inert, and it's imposed upon. However, as part of the project in Melbourne, I became very aware of how Aboriginal cultures offer radically alternative approaches to ways in which stone is remembered with. These practices have endured for many thousands of years, and they're not connected, this is the critical bit here, they are not connected to the construction and installation of stone memorials. Strikingly, they remember with the stony materialities that already exist in the landscape. In following traditional lines of travel, key features in the landscape constitute traces of the actions of ancestral beings. And a mnemonic journeying is further underpinned by the singing of song cycles at significant sites along the route. As Ross Gibson notes, cultures which do not rely on written records know that their environment is their world of meaning because landmarks hold the prompts to the stories that constitute knowledge. As such, these storied landscapes are effectively saturated with memories, disclose the occurrence of important historical events, and serve as locations for ritual, such as this site here. And this is not far from Melbourne in Victoria. And this is called Nari, and the English name for it is quite appropriately is Mount Egbert. And it's regarded as synonymous with eggs on account of these ovoid granite formations that are scattered across its slopes. But because it resonates with the associations of eggs with fertility, there are birthing trees in the vicinity of the stones that provide venues at which women continue to give birth, which is kind of amazing that the landscape has been remembered with. And this really will go back thousands and thousands of years, far longer than European temporalities. And then the other story that I want to talk about is about volcanic activity that took place 5,000 years ago. So what I'm going to relate to you is a kind of a myth that derives from this oral culture that is 5,000 years old, which is, again, is a bit mind-blowing for us to consider an oral myth being that old, but it is. And so I focus on this volcano here. This is an old volcano called Tarrengower. And it was a big volcano, and then this newer volcano, Lalganbuk, erupted. It came to prominence, but it was nowhere near as big as Tarrengower, the old volcano. And the younger volcano thought it would challenge the authority of the older mountain. But no matter how much it tried to rumble loudly and produce copious amounts of ash and smoke, the larger volcano, Tarrengower, just ignored it. The disregard of the older volcano continued even when Lalganbuk started to spurt out the rocks that still litter the landscape between the two hills, as you can see them. This ineffective onslaught culminated in Tarrengower summoning his powers for one final furious explosion. Laugenbuck summoning his powers for one final explosion because Tarrengower continued to ignore him. And this was disastrous, though, because he blew out his core, rendering an extinct volcano automatically. So these time-honoured stony sites, important intercultural and temporal perspective, the hylomorphic practices that may slide into historical and symbolic obscurity and weather into indistinguishability, as happens to most of our statues, really, or memorials. They conjure up a very different, powerful, affective and sensory relationship with stone, a mode of remembering that implicitly critiques the material impositions of the elite to secure memory and meaning in space. Okay, so the final bit that I want to talk about is hauntings. And really, I suppose this is an attempt. It also kind of resonates with some of the things we've talked about over the last 2 days. But it's also an attempt to acknowledge the often ineffable feelings that may arise through encounters with materialities, which, as I've said, we've heard about quite a lot in the last couple of days. And I want to talk about geological hauntings to start with, which we have certainly talked about. And uncannily, and I kind of think this has come up a lot, but it's very evident that stone is fluid when viewed within its proper duration as part of a continually moving lithosphere that belongs to a temporal frame that's impossible for us to grasp, because these endless transformations are either too slow, too fast, or too vast to perceive or easily comprehend. In returning to questions of how stone is deployed to remember, Gary Briley refers to how landscapes include a geologic memory of the tectonic, volcanic, sedimentary and erosive forces that continuously and have continuously forged topography. The urban landscape, too, is haunted by these non-human elements and the stone that's supplied to build it, disclosing the realms that existed before human life existed. And here this is from Manchester Central Library, and this is Portland stone, probably Britain's favourite stone, I think, over history. It's a white limestone formed about 135 million years ago on the bed of shallow, warm subtropical seas. And this rock here contains fossils of all sorts of life forms: shell fragments, fish spines, sea urchins, gastropods, algae, and ammonites. Organic remains of a long-distant environment. And here, this is a kind of amazing thing. So I walk around Manchester with a geologist, and this is a bit of coarse hill sandstone from the Scottish borders. When they built the Bridgewater Hall, there's a little precinct there, and this is part of it. And this guy said, "Oh, look, a flood occurred in the Triassic period in a desert 3 million years ago, or 300 million years ago, shall I say." I was like, "What?" But he saw that in the stone. So the stone told him that in a way that I would never have recognised. The bluestone fabric of Melbourne, by contrast, belongs to the world's third largest basaltic plain, created by lava spewed from the vents of hundreds of volcanoes, like Tarrengower Land, extending across the state to 400 kilometres west of Melbourne. So it's not that old, really. And 5,000 years old in some cases. And here's an interesting example of this that kind of helps us think about the kind of vital, bubbling, viscous, violent events that took place. And this is liquefied lava that then encountered shallow water. So it was, it formed it took the form of a closed dome, and then the top was burst. So people call this a stone blister, which is kind of interesting embodied parallel, I think. So this resonates. All these things resonate with Doreen Massey's conception of place as a temporary constellation that contains multiple stories so far. So this is kind of important because it obviously kind of underpins how there's no intrinsic indigeneity in which things are eternally present. Instead, places and landscapes and stones are perpetually become very differently entwined. It's kind of interesting also to think about Lancaster. And I've noticed, I've never really thought about this before, when I got the bus last week, yesterday, in fact. So my temporalities are kind of getting confused here too. It's all made of the same stone. So where's it from? I kind of want to know where it's from. It must come from a quarry nearby, I am thinking, because it matches the kind of original texture and colour of the stone. So I'd be interested. If anybody could find out, please let me know where Lancaster stone comes from, because it definitely comes from a local source. I'm almost certain. So, in addition to this, though, there's all sorts of other hauntings that take place with stone, and it can be conjured up through different kinds of absences. So, in buildings and in structures, in walls, a gap can identify that which is not there. A replacement or repair heralds the absence of an original material entity. A residue or trace reveals the absence of that to which it belonged. A thing may have altered over time to become a shadow of its former self and may have eroded. And the disused tracks of an obsolete network that formerly connected people, things and places testify to vanished material relationalities. So some are kind of really quite obvious, like vestigial quarry faces. Now, this is Manchester's original quarry. It was closed down over 230 years ago. And so most of the stone in Manchester, most of the stone buildings in Manchester were made from this. It's a mile from the city centre. But it was abandoned because it's not very good stone and canals opened up. And so much better stone could be brought in that was going to be much more durable. And you can still see, this is old, but you can still see, chiselled markings that reveal how workers worked on this. And here also the road from the quarry. So the quarry is just behind here. Those stone faces you see, and here, this is the cobble road from the quarry. They used to celebrate. They used to supply the city centre. And this quarry here is kind of a massive quarry, Runcorn Quarry, which is near Liverpool. It supplied stone for numerous buildings in Manchester, northwest England and beyond. I think it was the biggest quarry in Britain at one point. But it's been active for a century, and now it's part of a large country park. And here what you can see well-worked cliffs. But you can also see the old tramway, or the route of the old tramway that would have transported the stone to Manchester. So again, another ghostly feature. Much urban stone bears engraved marks that mark the presence of long-gone people. Often we just don't know what they mean. And like in Melbourne, on Melbourne curbs, there are all sorts of arrows and letterings that are kind of quite hard to understand. But they haunt Melbourne's walls, curbstones, gateposts and cobbles. And there are other things as well. There are other absences. Those are the ghostly remnants. So this is a wall that goes around this huge park in central Melbourne called Carlton Gardens. And you can see it's kind of a low boundary wall. But you can also see that it's embedded with these diamond-shaped holes. And in 1928, they were all removed because they wanted to make the park more publicly accessible. It was kind of only open it was an exclusive space. And then they removed it so that it became more of a public park. And these railings have been located at different destinations across Melbourne, so they've been redistributed. But this kind of haunts us with an image of this kind of privatised park, of what was. And also, you'll see here's an old bluestone laneway, and what you see here are the wheel tracks of the iron-rimmed horse carts that once travelled across these streets. Very clear, engraved into the surface. Of course, that doesn't exist anymore. The profound affective and sensory charge generated by encounters with much older worked lithic materials is depicted by John Harries, who describes how coming across a cache of old stone tools in Newfoundland provoked an ecstasy of knowledge. He says, felt in the tactile encounter with that which is present to hand, and yet in its presence reveals an absent other. And it solicits this intimacy with the long vanished people. And so these kind of things exist, and we can touch them, we can feel them, and we can conjure up these quite intimate relationships, I think, in bizarrely. And Harries maintains that touch inaugurates a more proximal way of knowing that proceeds from a reflexive apprehension of the bodily experience of dwelling in the world. Through touch, he argues, we rediscover the lively being of stone and clay, and through this tactile understanding, some appreciation of the lived experience of long ago people. So I imagine, archaeologists often feel this when they kind of come across stone tools and artifacts and shapes. Okay, so what these ghostly encounters, I know this is a stone cart, the residue of a stone cart, but what this is, I've no idea. And so often these kind of these ghostly remnants can only be kind of dealt with, I think, through speculative accounts. And I think that's completely fine. I think we need to do that, though, and we shouldn't be frightened of it. Okay, so just to finish, and because this is in Lancaster, I spent a bit of time here recently, or near here, and within an area of about 15 square kilometres that includes Bentham, Ingleton, and Kirby Lonsdale, here are some stone celebrity items. So they're all near here. I'm sure many of you will know them. First of all, this fantastic thing, the Great Stone of Four Stones, a huge boulder that is near Bentham. And as you can see, people have carved steps into it back in Victorian times, I think, so you can access the top. Does everybody know this? Wow. It's a fantastic lump. It's really worth seeing. It's a very charismatic, super charismatic rock. Also, and this relates to what we've been hearing about earlier about limestone, about karst country, is around Ingleborough and all sorts of other parts of North Lancashire and the Yorkshire Dales are these extraordinary limestone pavements that are really, really worth walking on and seeing. An extraordinary landscape of kind of clefts and little mini valleys that have been shaped by the action of rainfall and water on limestone. So these are kind of really hard to walk on, but they down below are all these caverns and caves. So they herald a kind of shaping of the landscape that we can't see as well beneath the ground, which is kind of extraordinary. Also, and this has already been mentioned in an earlier presentation, these fantastic Norbert erratics. Do people know these?
Yes.
Yeah, these are fantastic things. Over 100 sandstone and slate erratics transported to limestone country from the north. And some of them sit on, these are kind of millstone grit type stones, and they sit on limestone. So they're interested. They're almost like staged by these sort of unofficial plinths. And then here, I don't know if you'll know these, but these are Andy Goldsworthy's sheepfolds. And there's 46 were created between 1996 and 2003. And there's lots of different types of them. But these he calls boulder sheepfolds. And they created where an old derelict fold stood, and it's been restored, and then they've moved a nearby boulder to sit within it. There's quite a lot of them. There's about 20, over 20. And there's a route that you can follow, and they're all kind of clustered around each other. And if you type in Andy Goldsworthy sheepfolds, you'll find them on the internet. You can go and visit them. They're very near, and they're extraordinary works. Here is an earlier lithic entity that's kind of quite ghostly, which is a Roman milestone in the Church of the Holy Ghost at Middleton in Cumbria, but again, not very far away from here, quite close to Kirby Lonsdale. And as you can see, it's like a Roman entity that was used as functionally to kind of mark the distances between places and roads. And then finally, again, talking about the ways in which, about limestone quarries, we've heard quite a lot about, and the metabolism of limestone into lime is the amazing, really amazing Hoffman kiln. Has anybody seen this? This is bloody extraordinary. It's absolutely bloody enormous. And it's near Ingleborough. It's huge. It's the length of 2 football pitches. It's a huge thing. And behind it is this colossal limestone quarry that they got the stone from. And it was a kind of a step change in creating lime. And so next to the Hoffman kiln, is this railway that used to transport the lime that was produced from here away. So I just thought I'd have a little bit of a itinerary that you could potentially visit. around not far from Lancaster. So thank you very much.